jugadores. Y si hay alguien que sabe de esto, son nuestras siguientes invitadas. Por eso dejamos que Moya Dodd y Baird nos compartan su gran experiencia.
Greetings, everyone, from our virtual studio. Thank you very much for joining us here at this first edition of Summit Liga MX, where we'll be looking at the latest trends in the world sports industry and sharing knowledge and exchanging best practices. I'm Moya Dodd. I'm a former national team player from Australia and a former member of the FIFA Council, where I enjoyed 3 years of great adventure helping the world's game. Today, I'm very excited to bring you this session on my favourite subject, women's football. We've seen the growth of the World Cup over the last 30 years, and now it's the turn of the leagues and the clubs to drive the growth of a new era of professionalism. And with me today to talk about it is none other than the boss of the National Women's Soccer League, the commissioner in the US, Baird. It's hard to compress Lisa's CV into a short introduction, but I'll try. Lisa's been the NWSL Commissioner since March of 2020, responsible for overseeing all league operations with a focus on growing revenues and audience while elevating the profile of the league globally. Before joining the NWSL, she had a storied career in marketing, most notably 9 years as the Chief Marketing Officer for the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee, where she facilitated nearly $1 billion in partnership agreements and increased sponsorship royalties by more than 30%. She also spent 3 years as the Senior VP of Marketing at the National Football League, where she directed consumer products, direct marketing, e-commerce, entertainment marketing, and advertising programs. She's also had spells at New York Public Radio, General Motors, and IBM, where she led its global marketing communications initiatives across more than 70 countries. Well, that's quite the CV. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. Gracias and buenas tardes.
It's great to have you here. Well, that's quite the CV. After all of that, what made you want to run the NWSL?
Well, I was at New York Public Radio and I received a call and they said, listen, we are looking for a commissioner of a women's sports league. They didn't identify which one it is. And I think when you get that kind of call, you're going to say, yes, I'd like to learn more. So it just began that way in November of 2019. And a few short months later, after an extensive interview process, I was lucky enough to get the interview and land, which kind of what I thought would be my dream job is my dream job, but has been quite challenging.
Well, it must have felt like a bit of a nightmare job was it your second or third day of work where you had to suspend the league due to COVID? I mean, has anyone ever had a more dramatic start to a new job? I'm not sure.
Well, I guess that's why they created that phrase, baptism by fire. I don't know. I can only imagine. But it was very sobering. On your second day, you come in, you have a remit from the owners to have a vision and a plan, and you basically put it on the shelf. It was quite sobering to see the worldwide sports industry just shut down overnight. I mean, that's what happened. I think the sports executives and the athletes and the governing bodies really understood very quickly how much league and governing body was going to be a new game plan.
And it came at a terrible time for women's sport because you could just feel the momentum building. The money was starting to come in, the crowds were starting to come in. And I think what we all feared, certainly I had a drastic fear that when times get tough, the women would be the first to get cut. And we did see that in some sports. Yeah. But you must have had an incredibly intense first 3 months in the job because by July, you actually had the NWSL back as the first pro sports league in the US to return to play. So walk us through that a little bit. That must have been an incredible period.
Yeah, and I think at first what people did in around the world is they just suspended operations till they figured out. I mean, remember, no one knew what COVID was at that time, and very tragic education and how profoundly, much this disease, this disease and this virus has affected the population. But at that point in time, I don't think anybody knew. So we started this series of suspending operations. What quickly dawned on me after about 3 weeks was that I couldn't just call up my colleagues at other leagues or even around the world. I called the IOC, I called people at FIFA, I called everybody. No one had a game plan. No one knew how to stage live sports in a pandemic. And so we began the hard work of creating our own roadmap to get back. And of course it was guided by 3 principles, one of which was guided every league, which is how to do so and safeguard the health of the players. And that made pretty much everybody take the unfortunate step up front of saying no fans. There are still some people that we operate under very conservative restrictions, but number one, no fans. And number two is really how do you safeguard the athletes and the staff? So that took us a while to put together those medical protocols. The second piece, and this is to your point, Moya, about women's sports, we are a very nascent league. We are only 9 years old, nueve años, and to enable us to kind of go through hard times. Our biggest sources of revenue are sponsorship and ticket revenue and broadcast. So we had to scramble and create wholly new revenue sources to enable us to do anything. We would have had to stand on the sidelines, and there were some big leagues and governing bodies that said we're just going to not compete last year. Much bigger than we did. But I had that feeling that you did, which is we had all this momentum of 2019 for women's football. It would have been such a shame to not be able to capitalize it. So we created the revenue. We signed 3 new sponsors, national sponsors. We were able to get a grant from the U.S. government through the Small Business CARES Act is what it's called, that helped us pay the players. And we just had our head down doing this. And I remember it was April 25th. We were ready to make our announcement that we would be back in competition. We had to renegotiate our media agreements. We had to do everything. Renegotiate player agreements, one of the things we're most proud of is that we reached an agreement with all our ownership to continue to compensate the players without any reductions through the pandemic. And then on April 25th, came downstairs and I was ready. CBS, our partner, was going to do the announcement, and I turned on the TV and there was Gary Bettman, who's the commissioner of the NHL. And I went, oh, I guess the NHL is coming back. And now all of a sudden it dawned on me, and in the next 2 to 3 days, that we were the first professional league to go back, team sport to go back to competition. It was amazing because we were able to do it. We were able to be first back. On the other hand, what was kind of hard about it as a women's sports is that we did not get the recognition for that. It was really hard to be able to get people to understand who our league was, what we were about, and be able to do that. So it was pretty momentous time for us. But in the end of the day, I think we made the right bet, if you will.
Well, it was very interesting during COVID that those leagues that could continue to play games were very few, and they were very watched around the world. I remember seeing the Korean Men's League, and all of a sudden it had this enormous viewership throughout Europe that it had never had before, simply because it was playing and most of the European leagues had been suspended. Now, the NWSL scored about a 500% increase of viewership year on year in that Challenge Cup series, which I think was held in July. So to go from suspending the league in March to re-announcing that it would happen in late April to actually holding it within less than 2 months in July and scoring a 500% increase in viewership. I do wonder whether the fact that you were the first and only league back at that point must have helped those numbers. But I also want to ask you about the broadcast conditions. I mean, you have a background in media and marketing, so you'll know this much better than me. But it struck me that women's sport has always suffered from this idea that nobody's interested in watching it in the stadium. And if you haven't got a full stadium, then who wants to look at a broadcast of an empty stadium? Because they'll just flip channels. They'll think it won't have atmosphere. And, you know, if you want women's sports to get on television, then the first thing you should do is fill the stadium and make it more exciting for us to broadcast. I've heard that in various ways many times over the years. And then you had COVID and nobody had a crowd. So you could be watching the Men's Champions League final and that would be in an empty stadium too. So in a way, the viewer had to suspend their negative judgment about an empty stadium. And once they did, once that no longer signaled that it was somehow an inferior product, you know, they actually looked at the game and thought, you know, that really is worth watching. And maybe that was part of the 500% increase, as well as being, of course, one of the very few products that they have had of live sport. I'd be really interested in your thoughts on all of those empty stadium measures that broadcasters suddenly invented. They had artificial sound streams. We saw giant screens by the side of the pitch that players would celebrate in front of, like a little Zoom images of lots of fans. You had cardboard cutouts. Literally, people would pay maybe 20 euros to have a cardboard cutout of themselves in the stadium. All kinds of things were tried. And you know, I just wonder if that was also to the benefit of women's sports, which traditionally have had much smaller crowds.
I think it's a really interesting and probably quite accurate observation. I think you're right that maybe there is a bias that people approach women's sports with. I think we found that. You're right. We had record broadcast numbers for us in the Challenge Cup. And I think you're right. We took advantage of the fact that we were first back and there was an appetite for sports among the sports fan, and a lot of people discovered us, and that was amazing. What was also amazing is in the fall series, we did a series of exhibition games. They were just exhibition games. And again, we recorded very, very high numbers, not as much as we did in the Challenge Cup, but we recorded very high numbers on the broadcast. And again, I don't know if it was that didn't have fans, but I think people started to watch our games and realize what an incredible product it was, just the competition itself. And we're very blessed and lucky that we have some of the most well-known female professional football players in the world play in our league. And it's not just the U.S. women's national team. And it's people like Dabinia and Marta and, you know, Rachel Daly and Christine Sinclair. They are actually, you know, elevating. It's kind of, we're elevating them. They're elevating us. What is, I think, most exciting for us was not the 500% last year. It's the fact that we're still doing those ratings this year with the Challenge Cup. When fans are back, when there's a lot of sports to watch, and a lot, like now in the United States, you can see football on every day of the week. You can see EPL, you can see the Liga, you can see the Mexican, you can see every game every day of the week. And we are generating those kinds of ratings. And so our ratings are as strong as they are last year. We had our third record highest just this last Challenge Cup. So I think it goes again to the quality of the game and the athletes, and the fact that maybe there has been an opening of the bias that has been in the media towards women's sports, whether it was because of empty stadiums or, you know, it'll never generate. And I think I'm lucky in that I came from the world of the Olympics where that bias doesn't really exist, right? They'll put on, well, as long as it draws an audience, the Olympic broadcasters will put on whatever sport will draw the audience, whether it's women's gymnastics, women's beach volleyball, doesn't matter. They'll put it on because they know
it's interesting because the Olympics is without doubt the biggest gender balanced sporting event in the world. You know, you have the men's 100 meters, you have the women's 100 meters, and there's very few sporting events where you have that kind of balance of male and female athletes, actually. And of course, it was a loss that the Olympics was delayed by a year, and hopefully we still have it. But I just want to talk to you a little bit about your TV and media distribution deals, because they came in during that hectic period of your first few months. How do you do two deals like that in the first 3 months while you're living in COVID and trying to get a league back on deck?
So I was lucky enough that as I came in, those two negotiations were coming to conclusion, and they were just ready to be announced. And they had been negotiated with the help of Octagon, an agency, as well as the ownership group and an executive who was on loan to us, Lindsay Barons. What happened though? They were for regular season. So when we had to abandon our regular season plans, we had to renegotiate both contracts for this year. It was quite challenging to come up with, to get the airtime, to come up with the ideas to fight for this. So it was very challenging to do that real time. But we're lucky to have such good partners in CBS and Twitch, because they really helped support us and promote us. And both of them are the reason, that partnerships are why we've had the audience we did this year.
And I take it they've been happy with the ratings.
Yes. Yes. It's interesting because we have, one is a streaming deal and one is a broadcast plus streaming. And so from a broadcast rating standpoint, CBS has been quite happy. I think we're all learning how to measure streaming, particularly live sports streaming in an environment such as Twitch. I think Twitch, and I speak for them, they think they're quite happy. The one thing that we're discovering with live streaming is we had an international audience. We've developed quite an international following, and the times are not conducive. So we're going to have to do some things and learn to optimize the timing or the re-airs for the international streaming audience for Twitch. And I think it's only upside, because they've been really happy, given the fact that our international audience sometimes has to wake up in the middle of the night and turn on the game.
Well, speaking from Australia, we're quite used to that. Although highlights packages would be very welcome, no doubt.
Highlights packages would be really welcome.
Yeah. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about attendances in the stadium, because pre-COVID, back in those good old days that we can barely remember, it was interesting to see the growth of the crowds for women's football. And if you look at the FIFA report that just came out this week on leagues, the US and Mexico actually were two of the most high rating leagues for attendances. Now, since then, we've seen some growth in England that I'm sure will come out in the next report. But we've also seen some really phenomenal crowds when you move the match to the big stadium. There's that record crowd in Spain of almost 61,000. And the second record is actually from Mexico. It's the game of Monterrey and Tigres with 53,000. And that broke a record that was actually 100 years old. It took 100 years for women's sport to get back to where it was back in 1920, which is an irony all of itself. Do you see yourself getting some big stadium matches and being able to have a tilt at some of those records as COVID lets people back into the stadiums, as we're starting to see now?
Yeah, I mean, for us in the United States, as we look at it, the U.S. women's national team matches, whether it's against Mexico or Costa Rica or Hungary or, whoever it is, if it's a U.S. women's national team match, they'll draw that big an audience. They'll draw 20, 30, 40, 50, as it will, because I think there's always something very special about a one-off game and the national pride and passion that comes through with it. So we know that for women's soccer, there's an audience. What we need to do is a much harder lift, which is we have 12 home and 12 away games for each of our teams. It goes across a season that starts in May and ends in November. So we look at it with a little bit different lens than just the one-off game. You have to create the core season ticket holders. You have to make sure that you're broadening the scope from just the avid women's soccer fan to a mainstream sports fan. And we've got to make sure that we're really kind of building this. At the same time, we also have the appetite to build some league events that would kind of push us to the higher end of attendance. Like, say, an all-star game is a very tried and true league event in the United States. There's one for the NBA, there's one for MLS, baseball. So we're going to experiment, I think, over those. We now have some international friendlies that are coming in. So we're experimenting with our schedule with the hope that we'll build some tentpole events, but keep that base of regular season holders growing and growing, with the goal that we will have full sellout attendance at all of the team's home games.
And of course, you have Portland, which must be the highest average crowd for a women's team in the world, I think. I mean, they get close to 20,000 or so. I can't think of another team that has that. That's extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. And, while I'll say that market is very special, the stadium is unique, I'm going to give the credit to the ownership, Merritt Paulson and Mike Golub, for an incredible fan experience. They know their fans, they cater to them, the experience is amazing. And I think you'll see this with football in the United States. The closer the stadiums are to downtown, and the younger millennial audience, they prefer that environment of a downtown game and the bars. It becomes a social cultural event. And you can see teams that are really starting to capitalize on that. So one of our newest franchises, Kansas City, they had, I think, for their first regular season opener, they had 5,500 people. That was their first game. Orlando now is really starting to do that. Washington will sell out a game at Audi Field, which could be 20,000. So we're starting to see more than just Portland, but Portland is a unique ownership group, and I'm really proud that they're in our league.
Portland is a very interesting club, though, to compare with the Mexican League, because as we know, the Mexican League has all the same clubs in the women's league as in the men's league. And that's not the case in the US. I want to talk in a moment about the women-only club, because they're very interesting as well. But in Portland, we have a club that has common ownership across the men's and the women's teams, but they wear different colours, they have different names, and they're each marketed with their own identity, and that's been enormously successful. So even though you have sort of full integration at the ownership level, nonetheless, there's two different manifestations of teams that you see on the field. And I wonder if there are lessons there for other integrated clubs in how to market men's and women's football optimally to almost kind of double the audience, if you like, or to an increased audience.
Yeah, that's a very good observation, Maya. And we think that works very well in the United States. They all have different identities. There's a practical reason for it, in that because MLS is a different league than is NWSL, we wouldn't share trademarks. So it's not possible I guess it's possible, but it's certainly not a practice that we are going to intermix trademarks between the MLS and the NWSL. But I do think that barrier actually created something really special, because our leagues have our women's teams have such distinctive entities, and the fan base is so avid for the women's teams that I think that it's actually been the right choice. And it has allowed each team to develop its supporter group, its brand identity, and maybe if over the long term, we'll only know if it's long term, maybe that will drive the team valuations much higher.
Well, we have to now talk about LA City. We have to talk about Jean-Michel Aulas's investment in Seattle, in OL Reign. You do see, I think fairly uniquely in the world, the investment into just the women's side of the game. So there's plenty of investors who haven't bought into the MLS who've decided that they'll buy into the NWSL. And let's name a few, because they're big names. In LA City, you have the A-list of celebrities. You have Natalie Portman, Serena Williams, and a whole list of former US women's national team players like Julie Foudy and many others. OL Reign, you have Jean-Michel Aulas, who's the owner of Olympique Lyonnais. In Washington, you have presidential offspring who keep investing in them. You have Chelsea Clinton and Jenna Bush, I understand, in Washington Spirit. In North Carolina, you have Naomi Osaka. You have new investors in Chicago, in Kansas. There is clearly money for women's sport that is prepared to go straight into women's sport without also buying a men's team. So this is giving your teams a different personality. How does this come about? How did you make this happen? I think every league in the world would love to have a Serena Williams and a Naomi Osaka, or a Chelsea Clinton or a Natalie Portman investing in their league. How does this come about?
Well, I think that number one, sports is a great investment. So I wouldn't want to just the same type of valuation increases and different people investing in sports broadly. Maybe not at the European club level quite yet, but across the U.S. sports, if there's openings, I think what's happened is we've all of a sudden became just a very good investment. And so, yes, the celebrities add a lot of excitement and buzz to us, but we're just a very good investment. And so while we clearly are very excited to have those celebrity owners in our group, I'm excited. I must get a phone call a day. And they're, not only from celebrities, but they're from serious investors who want to see us because they see us growing. And those are just the hardcore questions on why we're a good investment. What's our long-term growth potential? What's the stability of the league? Will we have labor peace agreement? Those are the types of real questions that people ask about sports in America. What's the asset? What are the assets that are going to be most valuable? What are the team rights versus the league rights? Those are the in-depth conversations. So I'm really pleased. I think it does go back to the fact that women's sports has not happened overnight in the U.S. The WNBA has been doing this for 25 years. U.S. soccer has been our manager for 9 years. But I think last year, when we could have just taken a knee and gone to the sideline and said, we're not going to play, we really dove right in and we said, we're going to do it. And I think the fact that we proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that we can generate an audience, sponsors are interested in us, our product is great, we have the ability to collaborate with our players under challenging circumstances, we have tier broadcast partners and streaming partners showed the world that we're ready for that tier one look. That's where we are in American sports. And I think, the same, I would say I'm not quite as familiar, but in my conversations with Mariana and other people, Kelly at the FA and other people, I think they're seeing that same trend across women's football, where people are just saying, listen, let me get involved. I don't think it's just an American phenomena, although we might have had some big celebrity names come in, and we're very thankful to have them.
Well, talk to us a little bit about expansion, because you have a new team in this year and there's a couple more to come. We heard some news about San Diego just this week with Jill Ellis getting involved there.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about expansion plans and maybe the longer term vision of the league.
Sure. Well, expansion is something that we talk about a lot at the ownership level. We're very measured. We don't have plans to wildly expand. We're not going to get to the level probably of MLS or the NFL or the NBA. We're doing it thoughtfully. And I think the biggest, and again, this happened in the pandemic, it was very challenging when I look back on it, is California, the state of California, is the biggest soccer market, the biggest football market in the United States. Arguably on its own, given its population, it's probably one of the biggest football markets in the world, right? And California is a big state. And we decided intentionally to launch 2 teams in California in 22. We changed markets. We changed from Sacramento to San Diego. And that announcement was just made yesterday because of the ability to access an incredible stadium in San Diego. And I think what people are seeing with both Los Angeles, Angel City, and Sacramento is going to be the start of an incredible rivalry, not just in women's soccer, not just in women's sports, but in sports. And in sports in general, but in the United States in particular, having that derby, that rivalry, it's going to be great for us. And I know the ownership of both the teams very well right now. And let me tell you, even with all the celebrityness of Angel City and all the excitement, both of those ownership groups want to win. So I can tell you right now from the start that rivalry is going to be really intense. It's going to be a fight to the finish for the best athletes in the league, the best coaching staff, the best resources, training centers. So it's exciting to go into, and it's going to happen overnight for us. We will penetrate into the biggest football market in the United States, arguably one of the biggest in the world, with two teams at once. And that's going to excite the fans.
That's something to look forward to, because we've seen in England how the big derbies will drive big crowds and huge interest.
Yeah.
And
on my list, they don't know what a derby is, so it's going to be fun to teach that.
But speaking of England, and obviously all the European leagues come from a very deep and established football culture. They have clubs, global brands in many cases. Talk to us a little bit about how we outside Europe will compete against those European leagues in terms of what we can pay players, in terms of winning the audience. Because, here's my perspective as I sit here down under. In men's football, Europe are kind of the landlords of the world. The very best players go there, and then we all sit around the world and pay to watch them playing in a European league. And that's the pattern. In fact, on the world stage, only European and South American men's teams have won the World Cup. Nobody outside Europe or South America has won the World Cup in men's football. In women's football, the pattern's a bit different for all kinds of reasons, but partly because I think some of the big established football powers were a little bit asleep on women's football for a long time, partly because you have Title IX in the US, which has driven uptake of women's sport. But we see a different pattern. I mean, most of the World Cups have actually been won in North America, some in Europe and even Asia. At national team level. Right. And if you look at the top 5 leagues in women's football, they're certainly not all in Europe. I mean, certainly the NSWL is one of them, and you could argue Mexico is also one of them.
I would argue Mexico, absolutely.
So how do we, but another development we see, of course, is the ability of men's football to heavily cross-subsidise women's football in Europe. And in fact, UEFA just recently announced what they called it a cross-subsidy from the Men's Champions League into the Women's Champions League. So all those clubs who are eligible, playing in a league where the winners are in the Champions League will benefit from that in Europe. And that presents a challenge for those of us outside Europe to keep up with clubs who are able to access this kind of cross-subsidy from the men's game in Europe, which is unquestionably where the biggest wealth is right now. We saw a flow of US players and Australian players, for that matter, into Europe last year. Actually, quite a lot have gone back to the US now, in your case. But what's in your crystal ball about attracting and retaining the best talent and helping the clubs in your league to keep pace with inevitably the growth of women's club football in Europe?
Well, clearly compensation is a big part of it. I mean, this is professional sport is a paid sport. So, we're going to have to compete. And as that goes up, we're going to have to compete for the best players in the world. So let's say that will continue to be a pressure point, and we'll all have to compete with that. I think the second thing is going to be that will benefit, like all countries, not just the European countries, is, Europe has this long tradition of football, but what you're starting to see is a faster growth of sponsor interest that's global rather than just concentrated in Europe, right? It took American sponsors a little bit. It took Australian sponsors, maybe Japanese sponsors, just to get started, to get to know soccer and to get behind soccer. Now you're seeing them more comfortable with football, more comfortable with this, and they're betting on it. So I think we'll be able to compete outside the US, and I don't just speak for US, for sponsor and broadcast dollars. We will be able to. So that bodes well. I think the other thing that people really don't, I think, continue to underestimate is how attractive it is for players to be with the best facilities, the best coaching staffs, to play in full stadiums. the players, sure, they're going to play for compensation. Sure, they're going to do that, but they want to be surrounded by an experience that helps them. And so when we talk to a lot of players, and some players who left and came back, look, having a championship that really counts is something important. I'm looking forward to that. Doing more of that in the United States. They want a championship, and we're going to be looking into something like that. Whether it's CONCACAF or FIFA doing it, who knows yet? But they need to have this idea of who's the champion of the world, however that's satisfied. The thing, though, is being able to kind of almost control your destiny in a way that I think players more and more across sports are wanting to do, right? This has been the decade of athlete empowerment. And beware of the owner or the league or the Super League or the commissioner that doesn't treat their unions and their players as true partners. And I think that we will be able to do that. I'm very confident, our relationship with the union is off to a good start, and we're doing reverse collective bargaining and doing all the right things. So I think there's going to be maybe more of a dispersed atmosphere in women's soccer than there is in the men, because we're kind of each of us in our regions has different strengths and different competitors. I think FIFA and the federations can enable it to be a global game, or they cannot. And that is going to be, it'll be really interesting. And I think I'll throw that question back to FIFA, what they see. What is their point of view? I would think it would be to have, solidarity and growth of the professional women across the regions. That's when I talk to Sarai, I certainly feel that. I certainly feel that the mission of FIFA as an international governing body is that way. But they will have the chance to do some very influential things. And I'm quite anxious to see how they embrace the professional women's game. I mean, I don't know that there's any professional league sports executive on the all-important Stakeholder Committee of FIFA. You might know that, Moya. I don't. But isn't the Stakeholder Committee one of the most important committees at FIFA? And isn't that where a lot of this is discussed and decided? And are there any female sports executives on that committee? Do you know?
Well, they have a task force for professional women's football.
But they're not on the committee with Victor or anybody, are they? Or is it? I'm just asking.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm not a member of that committee anymore. And I think there is some fluidity of, well, thank you. There's some fluidity of membership. For example, FIFPro is on that committee. And although, interestingly, I think the NWSL Players Association is not connected with FIFPro. So there are some very interesting things about your jurisdiction that actually mean some of these models of representation are being newly challenged. But I think one of the focuses that they've had is on training compensation, which will set the regulatory settings for how money can flow down from the top clubs and leagues back through into the system and pay for the development of players, which is also very important to get those settings right. So there are a lot of regulatory issues to think about. And it comes back ultimately to the vision for women's football, because you can set the regulatory settings to be whatever you like, but unless you know what you're trying to achieve out of them, you really don't know where you should be placing that dial. So I think there's a lot of interesting discussions to be had around the world. It should be a global discussion about what is our vision for the women's game globally. Do we want to have how many destination leagues, how many feeder leagues? What does that look like? How do we compensate people? What should be the profile of compensation? I mean, we see extreme profiles in the men's game. Do we want that? Or do we want something with more solidarity and less divergence between the best paid player and the worst paid player? What are our values? And so, it comes back, I wanted to ask you a little bit about this, because you've talked about athlete activism and empowerment, and certainly in the US and around the world, professional sportswomen have become very vocal advocates on progressive issues. We've seen in the US a lot of talk about gender equality, equal pay, LGBTI rights, Black Lives Matter, working mothers. All of these are issues on which NWSL players and other sportswomen, the basketballers, for example, they've had a lot to say about that. And certainly the personal brands of players, I think, are maybe more important to women than to men, in the sense that it forms a bigger part of their compensation if they have a big personal brand and a big following. And I see that the biggest players in the US, the Megan Rapinos, the Alex Morgans, they very much have their outspokenness on progressive issues as part of their personal brand. Is it also part of the league's brand to foster this kind of progressive, open talk and free speech on these issues? And how does that translate to sponsors and to other commercial partners?
Yeah, I think it is very much part of our brand values to be progressive, and it's less about advocating for a single issue, but ensuring that we have a platform where the voices can be heard, particularly of what I'll call underrepresented communities that need help from a partner or a platform to do that. So we've traditionally been a progressive league. We've always had very open policies. We embrace, freedom of choice, and that in any way it's shame. And we give our players, not only those with high profiles, but in teams and each players, the rights to express that voice and express those points of view. I think that's who we are as a league. I think the bigger question to me is, in doing so, are we reaching the audience whose mind we need to maybe change? So it's not just saying it, it's reaching those who you want to compel. And that's where the league can be a very valuable partner. Can we develop the audience? Can we actually meaningfully change? And I love to give this example because I'm so proud of our athletes, and I'm so proud of the women of the WNBA that were very strong last year in a year of George Floyd, a very tragic moment for the United States. And I think it just unleashed the biggest movement in the world, which is the Black Lives Matter. It was the biggest movement last year. But I'm also proud of other leagues in the United States, such as NASCAR, that people don't look at NASCAR as a progressive league at all. And yet the leadership and the athletes did something very important for the Black Lives Matter movement. And they reached an audience that maybe needed to hear the message, even more so than the progressive audience, that we already have empathy and we already have that. So I will say I was proud of sports in general last year for embracing this. I think as an industry, we moved forward, and we have to remember it's not only the athletes themselves and giving them the freedom, it's creating the open dialogue and audience across the world to enact change.
That's a fascinating comment. And it's interesting, I'm sure, for you as a marketer, thinking, who is my market? Who is my target market? Obviously, younger people are going to be drawn into those progressive messages. But how do you want to reach the NASCAR fans? How do you broaden your audience and really build out the product in what is sometimes a very polarized political environment when you're standing on these progressive issues?
Yeah, and I don't pretend to be a political body. We're not. We are not. We are a sports entity first and foremost. So my job is to make sure that the league is enabling the growth of the best game ever. My job also is to give the athletes, a platform. But in growing the audience, which helps us become a sustainable, successful league, we also make those athletes more effective. But my job first and foremost is not to be a political change agent. It's to be a commissioner of a sustainable, successful league and to enable my players to have the platform. I don't think you'll find me making a political statement. It's not my job, but I do think that sports as a whole has a job to grow the audience in different interesting ways. And you are right in saying that my objective is not just to have a women's soccer fan or even a women's sports fan. It's to have a mainstream sports fan following our league. And that could include NASCAR fans or NFL fans or EPL fans or rugby fans or gymnastics fans. I just want, we want to be a top tier league in the United States.
And around the world, no doubt. It is a challenge, though, because, if you have a very outspoken athlete, then some people will be really drawn to that, and other people might find themselves on the polar opposite end of their political views and think that, and then I guess their feeling about the sport in its entirety is driven by their feeling about that athlete's views, and that presents a challenge for a marketer.
Yeah, that falls under the title of my next chapter, which is Sports is Complicated. And if you can't really handle ambiguity very, very well, don't go into sports as a career.
Find another job.
Find another job. Yes. The answer to what you just said, Nueva, is yes, it's very complicated. And you know that, I think.
But I guess brands are increasingly looking at sport not just as something that you win and lose at, but it's something that has a social purpose and it's connected with society more broadly. And I think that's really the point that you're making. So with those brands behind a sport, then inevitably you're going to get some growth in the audience.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we're coming to the end of our time now, but I wanted to ask you one last question. If we were to have this conversation again in 5 years' time, what would the league look like in your wildest dreams? Or in your realistic expectation as well, I guess, perhaps.
Well,
what does the end of episode look like?
Hopefully, in 5 years' time, maybe I could be a real guest at this conference. I was so delighted and honored that Mariana asked me to be here. So let's hope that 5 years from now that maybe I will be in Mexico City and enjoying that city that I love so much, doing this in person. I think, of course, we want to have sustainable commercial success. We want to be a league that has what we call in the United States labor peace, because our unions and our labor laws are very important in the United States. And I want to have that collaborative relationship with our players, as every commissioner does. I would love our league to be discovered by a global audience. We're still quite small. So, having us continue to be discovered and build our fan base, maybe double, maybe triple I don't know exactly the number today. I've got an estimate, but we're working to solidify that. I think along the way that every commissioner probably has the goal, the dream to create something that's a legacy for the league. I don't know what that is yet. I think I'm still in the process of discovering that. But I think that if there was something that I would really love the chance to do, because we're not quite excellent yet, is work very closely with our players in the area of diversity and inclusion, because I don't know that we as football in the United States are quite as open and accessible to all parts of our population, whether it's Hispanic or Black. I think that's something that we underperform in, and it's hard to say that, but I know that sometimes we need to be better as a league, and we're working very, very hard on that right now with our players, and going through the kinds of growth and change that we need to. But I think 5 years from now, I would love people to say we're very good at that, and I don't think people say that about us today, and I'd like very, very much for that to be an achievement for our league.
Well, that's a terrific ambition. And it starts with asking yourself those hard, difficult questions. So congratulations to you and the league for doing that. Thank you very much for joining us today for this very important session. It's given us a lot to think about and reflect upon for the development of women's football in Mexico, in the US and around the world. And it's been a real privilege to be joined in this conversation by NSWL Commissioner Lisa Baird. So a big thank you to you, Lisa, for sharing your stories and your knowledge with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Stay tuned to Summit 2021 through Liga MX digital platforms. Back to the studio.
Gran plática, sin lugar a dudas, para conocer un poco de cómo se está moviendo el fútbol femenil a lo largo, sobre todo de Estados Unidos, porque es una realidad, Heriberto, que es la mejor liga, es la selección campeona, han llevado su liga a grandes niveles y es un honor además que sigan hablando bien de la liga BBVA MX femenil, considerándola una de las mejores ligas del mundo, incluso gracias al trabajo, por supuesto, de Miquel Arreola, de Mariana Gutiérrez, la directora de esta liga. Se va creciendo y conocer cómo se fundó y lo que está haciendo bien Estados Unidos nos sirve claramente de ejemplo.
En algún momento escuchamos que está ya dentro de las 5 primeras ligas femeniles del mundo, lo cual es realmente bueno. Empezó con cierta lentitud, pero se dice por ahí lenta pero segura.
Exacto.
Así va la liga femenil del fútbol en México, y qué interesante también conocer este universo nuevo, comercial, deportivo, empresarial, que tiene que ver con las mujeres jugando al deporte más popular. Vamos a ir a una pausa y continuaremos con ustedes.